Yeah.
That's it. Is that working for everyone?
Mhm.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for joining us for this morning session. We really appreciate you all being here and to my fellow presenters for kind of getting this roundtable lined up. So many of us here are former interns in documentary editing projects, emerging professionals on a wide variety of projects right now. So I really look forward to our discussion here and talking about kind of emerging professionals and the state of the field of documentary editing and how we can move forward in the future. I want to start by just asking each of our presenters here to introduce themselves. So we'll just kind of go down the line, and then we have some prepared questions that we'll discuss, and then we want to open it up for plenty of opportunity for audience discussion, things like that towards the end of our session here today. I'll go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Katie Hatton. I am the managing editor of the North Carolina Colonial Records Project that's run by the state government of North Carolina. Previously, I have a master's degree in public history from the University of South Carolina. I got my start with Connie and Mary at the Pinckney Papers. I worked briefly as an assistant editor at the Van Buren Papers before ending up with the state of North Carolina, where I am now. But if the rest of our illustrious presenters could introduce themselves.
Yes, thank you so much for that introduction. My name is Riley Sutherland. I am currently at Harvard working on a history PhD. I earned my bachelor's in history, American studies, and memory studies at the University of South Carolina, where I also did a master's in history. And I started experiencing documentary editing work in high school when I interned for the Harry Truman Presidential Library in the National Archives, transcribing documents, but really didn't understand or start understanding the field until I started interning with the Pinckney Papers project as a college undergraduate student.
Hi, my name is Chad Allen. I am a former and current intern. I got my start as a undergrad intern at the Pinckney Papers as a undergrad history student at the University of South Carolina in summer 2017. And now 6 years later, I am once again an intern under Katie here at the North Carolina Colonial Records Project. So another internship under my belt. And so, yeah, and after starting out as an intern, I worked as an editorial assistant at the Pinckney Papers for 5 years before starting grad school in last fall. So.
Hi, I'm Zoe Harekny. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of South Carolina, where I also earned my MA in public history. I am about to reach 3 years with the Pinckney Papers in September, as this internship has evolved. And before I started working with the Pinckney Papers, my background was in museum education and work with the South Carolina Department of Education. Currently, I'm maintaining my internship with the Pinckney Papers, but I also am a social media manager for Nursing Clio.
Thank you, Zoe. Hello, everyone. My name is Trey Capps. I'm also involved with the University of South Carolina and the Pinckney Papers. Yeah, so I first got involved with documentary editing my first year of grad school. As part of the public history program at the University of South Carolina, we have to have an internship during the summer between our first and second years. And I learned about the Pinckney Papers. Connie, our director, actually came and talked to a class that I was in called Digital History. So I was introduced to it as sort of a digital history type of project, or came more from that perspective than as like, I sort of learned what documentary editing was later. But I was really interested in some of the problems of digital humanities, and the Pinckney Papers seemed like a good introduction to that. But that's sort of how I got into the field, and I'm still doing some work for the Pinckney Papers now. But I have my master's in public history from the University of South Carolina.
Good morning. My name is Gwen Freese. I have never worked for the Pinckney Papers. I'm very happy to say that I worked for the Adams Papers. I'm currently the production editor of the Adams Papers, located at the Massachusetts Historical Society. I majored in history and corporate communications, so I'm going to have a little bit of a different perspective on this panel because all of my internships were in marketing. But I'll tell you more about that in a little bit.
Thank you very much for that. So the first question that I have for our panelists today is, what did you expect from your first kind of internships within the field of documentary editing, history, coming into this field? And in reality, what did you learn? You know, what was maybe your expectation versus the reality of learning things on the job for the first time? Riley, if we could go ahead and start with you.
Absolutely. So I didn't really know what to expect when I started working for the Pinckney Papers. I walked into the Pinckney office and said to Connie, I really love historical documents. Can I please work for you? And I did not know what I was getting into beyond transcribing documents. But I found that it was really valuable to me, not only as a researcher, right? This challenged me to see documents in a new way, but also as a teacher. I ended up staying on with the project through my master's degree when I was a teaching assistant in classes. And I started to see the ways that professors in our department were using our documentary editing project to design lessons. They were giving students assignments. Why don't you choose a document from the Pinckney Papers project and share it with the class? Why don't you look at the footnotes and why don't you see how those are written? Why don't you click on some of those pointer tags, those identification markers in the project? And it really challenged me to think, okay, if I were teaching a class, how would I use documentary editing to enhance the way students are interacting with documents, the way they're thinking about what history is? And so I think this internship gave me a different pedagogical lens, as well as a different lens for my own research, which was really valuable. It also challenged me to think more about participatory project design, which is something I hope to talk about a little bit later on.
Yeah, so similarly, I had absolutely no idea what to expect. Before I started in the summer of 2017, I had signed up for through University of South Carolina's public history program, a summer internship class that matched students with internship opportunities in the greater middle South Carolina area. And they gave us a list of about 10 or 15 projects or opportunities or programs. And I actually didn't share this until I think my last day at the Pinckney Papers. I think I put the Pinckney Papers either second or third on that list, ahead of like two local museums, because I had no idea what document editing was. I was vaguely familiar who the Pinckneys were just as a student of American history. So I really had no idea what I was expecting. And actually, here's another thing. I almost missed my first meeting with Bob Karachuk and Mary Scher, our two associate editors at the time. I remembered I was just going out my day. It's like, oh wait, I have that meeting in like 20 minutes. So I ran over and it took me, almost after a week on the job, I knew I'd found something that I could see myself doing. So I learned a lot quickly. And here I am 6 years later, still doing what I'm doing, 5 years at the Pinckneys later too. So yeah, I definitely learned a lot very quickly.
I began interning with the Pinckney Papers about 3 years ago. And before that, my experience for applications with my public history degree were in research, but also K through 12 education. So this was certainly a different route to take. I was familiar with printed scholarly editions because they were very helpful with my research, but I was completely unaware of how many digital born scholarly editions there are and how great they are to access for research. So it really helped with my research skills, but also my writing skills and my research skills, since so much of my work prior to that was, I don't want to say more public facing, but how do I explain this to a third grader? But then what's great is a lot of documentary editing can be used in the classroom to turn around and be like, how can I explain this to a third grader or a college freshman? It's brought a lot of opportunities. And I also got to work with another digital project, creating a website that sort of complements our editions through Pinckney Papers and university libraries. And I'm sure I'll get more into that later.
Yeah, so like I said, the first time I learned about documentary editing was when Connie came and talked to our digital history class. So I came to it from more of the digital history perspective of like, this is an opportunity to make information freely available or widely available, to sort of give scholars access to primary source documents. I didn't really know that documentary editing predated sort of that idea, but I learned that later. So, I mean, I think it was kind of what I expected. Like Connie talked a little bit about how they do the tandem reading and how they would transcribe the documents. So a lot of like things that I learned on the job were how to read this handwriting, how to sort of understand some of the more archaic things that were being said. Like, so really, I just had to learn on the job, like how to do the job. But as far as the transcribing and the tandem reading, I sort of expected to be doing that, and I got to, so that was nice.
So my original life plan was to be a sellout. I was planning on going into marketing and trying to convince people that they needed things that they didn't need. And my parents were kind enough to let me double major in history just for like my own soul. And so the people in the history department were aware that I liked the Adamses a weird amount. And so when there was a job listing to be the editorial assistant with the Adams papers, one of my professors sent me an email and he's like, "It's your job, apply today." And so I did. And so I don't have any internship experience in documentary editing, but it was like my right out of school, like I was shiny and new and like ready to explore this new field. I really didn't know too much about documentary editing. I didn't have a Connie. I sure wish I did. But I knew that whatever the job was, I had to have it because I needed to be thinking and talking about the Adamses all the time. And my coworkers will attest to the fact that I still do. So what did I expect? Well, just looking at the job listing, all those skills, it was like you need an attention to detail. It was basically like you need to be able to sit still for a couple hours and focus. And I was like, oh, I can do that. I can do that. I was excited about that. I think what I didn't realize that I had to learn for the first time on the job was how to be part of a team. I'm not very sporty. Maybe that's apparent. So I never really did any team things, and all of my internships were kind of like, if you've seen the movie Devil Wears Prada, it was a little bit like that. It was like, we don't have the resources, we don't have the staff. I was trying to think for this panel of the name of any of my internship advisors, and I couldn't. I didn't even see them. There was a bulletin board in one of them, and when I walked in, they were like, pick something. Like, it was like stressful. And so I kind of, from my internships, learned like hyper independence. And like, I actually had one of the advisors say to me, if you don't know how to do something, figure it out. Don't ask me. So I was like, okay. So then I got to the Adams papers and I'm like, I need to be able to figure this out. And so somebody would ask me how to do something. Like, I had never been to the post office before. We're among friends. I can confide that. And Sarah Martin put a volume on my desk and was like, can you mail this? And I was like, uh-huh. And then I went outside. I'm like, Dad. So I learned this hyper independence. And so it has been nearly 7 years of unlearning that. And Sarah has been absolutely brilliant at being like, do you know how to do this? Do you understand? Tell me if you don't. Like, and like learning that if I don't know how to do something, it's going to harm more than just myself. And it would be better for everybody if I would just say, like, can you remind me how to do this? So that would definitely be something I would say you have to learn on the job, in addition to how to work the U.S. Postal Service.
Thank you for that. I might just add that in my own experience, I went here for undergrad at American University. As you all have known by seeing the shuttles go around campus, they really love their internships here at American University. So I had an opportunity to intern in a variety of different public history and just kind of journalism focused opportunities prior to going to graduate school. And one of those that really stood out to me was working for C-SPAN, actually for American History TV that was here yesterday. So when I was in the course of doing my studies, I got myself acquainted with Founders Online, and I just found that it was such an incredible and amazing resource in the way that it made all these sources accessible and available for students like me that weren't necessarily able to go to all these faraway archives and figure these things out, especially because my family came, both my parents at the time worked in IT. I needed to know how these kinds of websites worked. How was it that they were doing all of this on the back end? So when I found out about the Pinckney Papers as a project at the University of South Carolina, I think it's one of, as contrary to popular belief, I think it's one of the best kept secrets of USC. That when I got there and finally had the opportunity to work with them, I thought I'd be doing a lot of transcribing, a lot of research, similar to the ways that we do in museums and things like that. But what really impressed me was the collaborative nature of it. I found that it was very much like what I had done at C-SPAN. It was kind of like a press room. Everyone had a beat. Everyone, had a thing that they needed to figure out. So, I get there and it's like, Katie, we need you to find out about every colonial ship that might have ever sailed into Charleston. Find out what we have to identify these captains. We became, all of us, very specific experts on the one thing that was part of that edition, but ultimately that all comes together into one larger project. I think I could probably speak for a lot of us in this room when I say that probably in school, or when we did group projects, we were probably the one that did most of the group project, and where was everyone else doing things? But I find that in documentary editing, it's absolutely a collaborative project. Everyone is absolutely giving their all to that. And I think that as a kind of overall addition, I found that very impressive at the time, and still do within our kind of network of scholarship, that everyone kind of that management is a real skill when it comes to this, and it's not necessarily something that we talk about a lot. Everyone has great ideas, everyone has great ways to research things, but coming together to create that one project together as a team, I found to be very impressive, and not necessarily something that I expected to encounter and learn about within documentary editing. So the second question that I have for you all is, what skills from the classroom did you find to be most useful in kind of embarking into the field of documentary editing?
So I had a bit of a peculiar classroom experience. I graduated from high school in 2019, right? Went away to college, so excited to learn about history, and then COVID shut everything down. I did almost the entirety of my BA from a table my parents stole from a trash can, right, in their guest room. So for me, online learning entailed all of this vocabulary. I had an incredible public history professor, and he showed us a picture of a records request slip. And he's like, okay, here's how to look at a finding aid. Here's what each part of this slip means. Here's how to go through the catalog. But then I actually got into a physical archive for the first time, and I had no idea what I was doing because I had all of these different words floating around in my head. The security guard stopped me and said, "Are you lost?" And I was like, "Yes, I'm here for the research." And how are you supposed to respond to that, right? So then when I actually worked for the Pinckney Papers project, I could see, as I was interning for them remotely, right, the way the folders were stored in our online collaborative drive. Okay, now I can imagine how that physical archival space works. So then when I had to go in to archives for my own research, I had such a better understanding of how I should apply all of these terms that I had learned in the classroom. And I think interning for a documentary editing project also taught me different lenses of writing and researching, because in those undergraduate classes, we had to move so quickly because we were covering so much content. I had one teacher in a lecture say, okay, today we are going to cover the entirety of World War II. How do you move through that quickly? And then I got to the Pinckney Papers project, and they'd say, okay, we need you to write an ID of this ship. Like Katie would say, we need you to write an ID of this one person. And to be able to do that micro level of analysis really changed my own research too, because I had all of this context from the classroom. I could see historiographic arguments, but I didn't understand how to use microhistory to help people fit into that space, to really elaborate on this bigger world I'd been exposed to in the classroom. So documentary editing gave me all of these different tools and ways to apply those tools.
Yeah, I have a sort of similar answer. Just like us editors, you learn very specific subjects you'd never thought in a million years. You kind of become an expert in a million tiny little things. And then actually for the semester before I started my internship, I was taking a history class on the French Revolution and the Napoleonic era. And that's actually where I learned about the internship class that summer. The professor was just like, oh, I have this handout here, like at the end of the class, just like casually put it down. And that's actually where all this started from that. But anyway, so it was an interesting class. I loved it. And like, I took extensive like lecture notes because like she would just sort of like tell the story of like the French Revolution. Like we're all kind of like enraptured while like, it was like, I don't know, it was like a great story, like a great podcast about it. But yeah, so starting at the Pinckney Papers that summer, they just happened to be in the sort of subject matter was a lot of, y'all are familiar with the XYZ affair at that time. Like, so this sort of like French political diplomatic history, it's like, oh wait, I just learned all about this in my one class. This is great. So I'd like literally bring in my like lecture notes to help with like write some of the IDs for some like the French politicians and other sort of figures that were involved then. So it was kind of a happy accident that I could actually apply something I had learned in one of my undergrad classes. So yeah, it's one thing where sort of the academic and sort of my job really kind of matched up perfectly there.
Yeah, for me, moving through graduate school, it seems like time moves so fast. The classroom moves fast, your nights are long, but you're moving through things so quickly, you kind of don't have the time. When I sort of entered the internship, I put myself on the pace of being in the classroom. I was moving too fast. So I think it was great to learn how to slow down. And then I found myself also learning how to slow down in my classes, and things kind of were working out better. So I think there's a wonderful relationship when you're in an internship, when you're able to figure out, when do I work the best? What are the times of day I work the best? What is it like to work in a team? And how do I get out of self-isolation? And how do I try to foster an environment of teamwork in the classroom? Or if you've had classes that successfully foster teamwork, how can I then move that to the workplace?
Yeah, I would say my answer is kind of short. The skills in the classroom that I found most useful, really what was helpful when we were trying to write IDs for different people who appeared in the Pinckney papers, really having a sense of like which research databases to kind of tap into, helped with the ID writing process. And then as far as getting context, like in grad school, a lot of times you learn to sort of move through books pretty quickly, either skimming or, kind of reading sort of the main point of every paragraph and moving along. And that skill was pretty helpful for sort of being able to situate myself in a part of history that wasn't the focus of my degree. So yeah, those are the skills from the classroom that were pretty helpful. But I think in a lot of ways doing the internship really helped prepare me for the job force in a way that the things that I would have only learned in the classroom would not have prepared me for. So I think I learned a lot more from the internship than I was able to bring to the internship from my classroom experience. So I think that's kind of and I think that's kind of where this panel is heading, but that's kind of the bigger deal. Yeah.
I'm going to go a little bit outside the box again. Sorry, I'm just doing like a one-woman panel over here. But so I think I actually developed most of the skills I need for my current position doing the student paper on campus, because you're working as part of a production team, you're creating a production schedule, you're having production meetings, everybody has a role that they're supposed to be taking. You're researching, you're writing, you're editing, you're copy editing, you're doing layout, you're on the phone with the printer. Mercifully, we don't have any advertisers in the Adams papers, so that was taken off my plate. But everything else, I actually have a couple colleagues who started out in journalism or had some experience in journalism. I think it is very similar. And there's also, like, I had to take journalism classes for my communications degree, and in the history classes, you're also thinking about like, what is the author's intent here? How are they trying to sway me? Like, you're really learning to be more objective. And in journalism, it was like, don't let the slimy politicians get you. Like, make sure you're sticking to the facts. And the slimy politicians have been dead for a couple hundred years, but they're still slimy. So you do have to still pay attention to what they're saying, and like, what is the subtext here? What is actually true? What's being said? Why do you have that thought and not another? So really, I would say both my degrees really helped me in the research part of what I do. And then the school paper helped me get it on paper.
Thank you for that, Gwen. The next question I have for us here is what kinds of documentary editing skills have you found in your experience that can maybe be helpful to students on the job market, once they do complete a project? And along with that, what recommendations might we have for how internships can help students more when preparing for that job market? We might start with you, Gwen, and go backwards.
Okay. I would say really the most important thing is to allow the people who are interning with you to understand the full picture of what you're doing. It's not just like, and I'm not saying we do this, I'm saying this is a bad example, but it's not just like, go scan these, go photocopy these, staple these, lick these envelopes, like what have you. We try to, like, I feel really lucky to work at the Massachusetts Historical Society, and I think that's probably a little different from working on a university campus because we have archives, we have conservation, we have gallery spaces, public programs, research, like every public history job you can have, we have under one roof. And so Sarah does a really fantastic job of making sure that the people who intern with us get to visit with the heads of all the different departments and learn about what they do. And then they sit down with me and I talk over what our production schedule looks like and how we get from a manuscript upstairs into a published book. And then every time Sarah gives them a task, she's like, this is what I want you to do. This is how this is going to be useful to us. And also anytime we have a department meeting, our interns do join us. And so they get to kind of experience what it's like to be in a professional workplace and see what they're actually doing. And so they're able to take that. And then when they go and interview for jobs, they're able to better articulate the experiences they've had, because it's hard to walk into an interview and be like, well, I did lick 500 envelopes. I do have a lot of saliva. Like you're so much better able to articulate, like we were working on this volume and it covers this period. And like I helped transcribe documents for this and I scanned things so that this editor could work on this. And I mean, just they would be able to so much better speak on the actual field. And I think also pick up, every field has jargon for better or worse. And I think when you go into an interview, if you already kind of know the code words, I think even subconsciously the person interviewing you views you sliding in pretty seamlessly. Like you already seem a little bit more like part of the team than somebody who was like me and was like, I know nothing, but I'm excited to be here. So yeah, I would say just really communicate what you're doing and include the interns as much as possible so that they remember your name as their internship advisor when they have to speak on a panel.
Yeah, I completely agree with Gwen. I think if you have interns, making sure that they understand why they're doing what they're doing is going to be a way to keep them invested in the process. Kind of the best example I have right now is like at the Pinckney Papers, we're sort of on the back end of some things, and I'm doing a lot of tedious tasks like renaming shared drive folders so that they match with what we have in our FileMaker Pro system. And that if you just handed that to an intern and they had to do this tedious task and didn't really understand why it was happening, what we're trying to accomplish through doing it, I think that the tediousness could get the best of someone. So once again, like Gwen said, sort of making sure that interns understand the bigger picture, that they're involved in staff meetings, they understand what the point of their small task is within the bigger project. I think that's very good for morale. Another thing I was going to say, the question was, how can it help students in an academic sense or a non-academic sense? Non-academically, I think a lot of documentary editing is project management, and that has applications in a lot of different contexts, even outside of history. But before I came to the Pinckney Papers and got into documentary editing, I worked in a museum. I did a lot of project management things. There are a lot of parallels between that. So I think the project management skills, the idea of sort of managing a lot of different moving parts at once, but all progressing towards a final goal, that is very transferable in a lot of different kinds of fields. So that's kind of a good way to help your interns sort of market themselves after the experience, if they're going into a different field after the documentary editing experience. And also, if you have interns who are history people, what I've kind of seen is that a lot of times when people first go to grad school, whether they're doing their master's or their PhD, there's always this question of like, what is my project going to be? Not everyone comes to grad school with sort of a concrete idea, or it can be really fluid, because you have to write something in sort of your statement of intent, like I want to study this, but then when you get to grad school, it can change. And documentary editing is really a good opportunity for someone to get really deep into an archive that is around a certain theme, or at least involved with, a certain time period. So, and obviously I think as people in the documentary editing field, we like when people use our collection. So I think if we could structure internships in such a way that the interns aren't doing a bunch of different far-flung tasks or aren't dealing with a bunch of documents that aren't necessarily related. If you can keep it sort of thematic so that they could build a project out of it, it might be the inspiration for sort of maybe their master's thesis or book chapter or even their dissertation. So that's a way that it could help them academically.
For me, what I really appreciated about my internship, it was with the goal of doing a special project about slavery, a digital project. So while I was learning the day-to-day editorial task of the Pitney Papers and being a part of those, there was sort of this road that was going to eventually lead to the creation of a website and other academic collaborations with our records dealing with slavery, many of which are featured in the digital editions, but some of which are not. So to be able to create a product at the end of an internship has been great, to bring up in job interviews or to put something on my CV that is like very clear, like, yes, I worked at the Pitney Papers project. I am knowledgeable in documentary editing. However, I have participated in a digital project, such as creating a website and sort of continuing academic collaborations in those directions as well. So to have a project at the end, I was very appreciative for that. And that was very beneficial for me working at the Pitney Papers.
I'll have a lot more to say about this specific topic next year when I re-enter the job market with an MA, hopefully. But what I will say is how this could help is from someone who was, working at a project versus an intern, but then going back to school. Just recently with pitching my thesis to my committee, I just mentioned like, oh yeah, like we have like all like 1,300 or so documents like relating to my topic of research on like, oh yeah, I have access to that. Yeah. Like, and they were like blown away like that. Wow, that's amazing. That's incredible. And I was like, oh yeah, that's normal. Right. So just like this sort of specific knowledge and like all like sort of like access like through the project to like all this research we've done for going on 10 years. It's been incredibly helpful coming back to school and like applying it in an academic setting. So we'll see. I think that'll translate to getting a job here in the next couple of years, but we'll see how it goes. It's certainly given me a lot of confidence, let's say. Like I was just saying, thinking about like applying for jobs or in interviews, like I don't have to make anything up. I don't have to add fluff. I don't know. It's just, I just say what I do. It's like, or say what I've done. Like, I don't need to like spin it. It's just like, yeah, I do this, and it's what I do. I don't need to. Yeah.
I think one of the most valuable things I learned in a broader job market that I never would have expected is how to establish measurable and time-bound organizational and financial goals, right? As an undergraduate student, I had all these big dreams about here's a project I'm going to start. I want to do this with documents. And somebody walked up to me and said, well, that's great, but how are you going to fund that? I said, oh, I haven't thought about that. And they looked at me like I was a complete idiot. And I was for not thinking about that. But I never had experience with business management classes. I really wish they had been integrated into my history program, but they weren't. So when it came to things like grant writing, budgeting, I didn't know how to do it. And I was talking to Connie about it, and she said, well, why don't you look at the grants that I've had to write for the Pinckney Papers project? Why don't you look at the budget, at the timeline I've had to make? And so I did, and I started studying how she had planned that out. And it really gave me a completely new perspective on planning when it comes to projects that would benefit any organization. A colleague and I back home just started a nonprofit research and restorative justice project, and we were having to go through all the 501c3 paperwork. I'd never done that before. And even though I didn't know all of the vocabulary, I didn't quite know what I was doing, just having that planning background from my Pinckney Papers internship helped me confront what I didn't know. It prepared me to ask the sorts of questions I needed to think about project sustainability. And that's something I never would have gotten in the classroom. That was really beneficial. Another skill that I picked up that I think would help, regardless of what position you're applying for, is how to write accessibly. I was so frustrated when I started my history program because I could not write well, and I knew I couldn't write well, but I didn't know how to fix it. So my advisor had me prepare this piece to submit for peer review. And it did not sound like my voice. I just wanted to tell stories. So that's what I kept telling people. I just want to be a storyteller. And they said, no, you have to make an argument. And I said, well, why can't a story tell an argument? they said, you have to fit yourself into historiography. That's not storytelling, that's analysis. And I didn't see where the division fit. And working for the Pinckney Papers project showed me that there isn't really a division between that. I was seeing how these stories of individual people I was writing, these stories of individual letters could propel an argument. And that really benefited me because I went from, I almost dropped out of my history program. I was so frustrated because when I told people about my research, I felt like I was speaking in another language from the rest of the world around me. And my parents would tell me, well, just make it to Pinckney Day, make it to the day you go to the Pinckney Papers. And I suddenly found that now I felt like I could speak the same language as the world around me. Now when I'm working for this nonprofit group, I go to pitch the project to potential donors. And I know how to use this story to make a bigger argument. I know how to use stories to show relevance. So the value of storytelling as a tool to actually make history relevant to other people is something absolutely essential. And it doesn't have to be history, right? It can be any type of scholarly work. To make it accessible to broader audiences is something that I think is really helpful on the job market.
Thank you for that, Riley. I'm in the kind of interesting position of having done many of these internships, but now also being in charge of internships. I hope that Chad will be kind to me in talking about his current internship supervisor. But in terms of thinking about the skills of documentary editing that can help students, what I'm finding now in my own experiences as a supervisor is that many of the students that are working on projects now are coming from this COVID era of doing a lot of things online. And so part of what I've been trying to do with my interns currently is just kind of building their confidence in things that maybe a lot of us would think is, very standard in general, but like going into the archive and pulling documents themselves to include in our edition. I have the benefit of working in the North Carolina State Archives building, so we can just go up the stairs and get those sorts of things. But being able to show them, here is what's something that's digitized, and we're going to go down and pull the card file, because we don't have things digitized within the state archive system yet. We're going to pull the card file. We're going to find where we need to do. We need to submit the request. This is what a microfilm reel looks like. I know that it sounds scary when it whirls like that, but it's okay. We're not breaking it. Just that whole kind of system of building their confidence, that I'd like to think that when they leave our internship, they have the confidence to do that kind of research in person on their own, without any assistance. Also, that just like we're kind of demonstrating, here's a source, but also we need to understand how we're going to interpret those sources. And I think especially in an era of fake news and things like that, evaluating sources generally is just a life skill. It doesn't even need to be for a specific job. Like Gwen, like Riley, like Zoe mentioned, just general project management and the grant system, different avenues for funding. Are all like I think really helpful things that we don't learn about in the classroom that people can take and apply in whatever kind of job they're going to go forward into. Also, just like writing accessibly. I come from a museum background, so when I was told that we need to write these annotations, I just kind of saw it as, okay, I'm writing a museum object label, but for a document or for a person. And in the same way, we can reverse that, or thinking about managing a digital database of documents, in my view, was the same as having a collections management system for a museum of all the artifacts with the internal information about, what work has been done on that document is the same as the revisions page on your digital project. So thinking about the ways that digital and documentary editing skills are transferable within other fields of history and also just generally life skills, I think is very helpful. And then finally, in terms of how internships can help students more, I think one of these things is helping students at the end of their project with resume building. So one of those things is giving students an opportunity to create their own project under our wing, so that then they can go forward and say, I've made this digital exhibit or edition as part of the North Carolina history. You can see it on their website. And also us just working with them and saying, like, let's see what you would write on your resume. What would you write about your experience here? And helping them, put this word in, put this word in. People might like to see this, helping them sell themselves, because a lot of it is just confidence building, that they do know how to do things and do know how to do them well. and making sure that they can translate that and communicate that to other people down the road, I think is very helpful. Our next question here, we'll maybe start with you, Riley. Many of us here have worked with Born Digital scholarly editions. How do you see your place within the digital humanities space?
I'm so excited about this question about the digital humanities. I was telling Zoe earlier that I just recently attended an institute, the Public Digital Humanities Institute, to think more about how documentary editing can fit in the digital history space. And it completely transformed the way I see our role in digital scholarship and really reframe the definition of what an archive means and what it can mean for me. So one example, the Pinckney Papers project, like many of the other projects here, we have those pointer tags so people can click on words and transcriptions, hover over a word or phrase, see what it means. And that interactivity is fantastic. So then I started thinking, okay, how else can people interact with documents in a way that can subvert the sort of mystic nature of the archive for so many undergraduate students? We didn't know how to navigate that space. And at this institute, we were looking at the Native Land Digital Project, right? So they're using documentary maps, treaties, things of that nature to create a map of how treaty boundaries juxtapose Indigenous language boundaries, things like that. How can we change the way colonial maps look? And I started to realize, okay, we can use these digital tools to completely change what a legitimate boundary means. So I had one professor say to me at one point when I was showing him this digital work, well, all digital history does is complicate arguments that historians have already made. You're just adding a bunch of extra tools to it to make it look pretty and to try to get funding, right? But these projects thoroughly convinced me that digital tools can be a way to completely theoretically reframe historical arguments. That's a bit more specific to history, but more broadly with documentary editing, I think the interactivity when we talk about multimodality is a way to bring documents to life in ways that wouldn't be possible. We had that Jefferson talk earlier, right, about how oral speech can enhance documents if maybe you want to hear what it sounded like. Music, I know my project partner and I in Missouri have been finding USCT music manuals and finding people to make recordings of those, right? What would the music have perhaps sounded like? So adding different sensory components to enhance accessibility, right, of the project for people who have various accessibility needs, but also to help people engage with history in different ways. So I think this synthesis between digital tools and documentary editing is really fascinating and is something I'm excited to explore more.
Yeah, so actually one thing I was really excited, or one of the several things I was excited about joining Katie's project at the North Carolina Historical Publications is their, what I'm working on is, what we're working on is our, we have a website. You could fill in the details, just like the, a sort of, what would you call it, digital archive and
It's a digital publishing platform.
digital publishing platform. Thank you. Yes. Just sort of a sort of open face, a very public facing website, which it's funny. That's the one thing skill, like at the Pinckney Papers, UVA handled all the website stuff. They handled all that for us. So that's something we didn't have to deal with. So that's one thing I was looking forward to learning, is dealing with the website management and sort of web presence ourselves, and having to learn that sort of element of digital publication and digital humanities, and getting some hands-on experience with that. So now having that experience, you know, the sky's the limit for me as far as what we could, I'm sure we'll come up with some great ideas down the road for what we could do with sort of digital publishing and digital archives. I guess I'll try not to step on our next question too much, because I think we talked about that, so.
Yeah, so when we're thinking about the digital humanities space, and I think this is what a lot of folks have been grappling with over the past few years, is just because you build it doesn't mean they will come. So how, and I think this is where skills in documentary editing can really push the boundaries of what digital humanities can be, because people are using these scholarly editions, print and Born Digital, people are using them, researchers are using them, and they were life buoys during the pandemic to many people trying to complete dissertations and thesis that did not have access to archives. So that importance can't be overstated. And then when you look at the digital humanities space and getting to work on a project like my website with the Pinckney Papers, people enslaved by the Pinckneys, It was, how can all these skills, a part of the documentary editing world, the collaboration of a project for over a decade, then be used to create a digital humanities project. So I think there's a lot of opportunities in there, just to further reach the public.
So documentary editing, I think, in terms of where it fits into the digital humanities space, it's certainly a big part of digital humanities is this idea of making information more widely accessible, sort of removing some of the institutional barriers to information that come with, like, I don't know, having access to an archive, having the money to pay for certain subscriptions to access information, or to be able to travel to certain archives. So that's certainly part of it. Something else, as I mentioned earlier, I had a digital history class, and one of the main issues that kept coming up was how archives sort of get migrated as new technologies arise. So sort of like the problem that archives end up encountering is, like, maybe you've made a scan of everything and put it on floppy disks. Well, once floppy disks become obsolete, then we have to update it, put them on CD-ROMs, and then there's always the next technology. So I think another way of looking at the field of documentary editing within sort of the digital humanities universe is to really think of it as it's always going to be one of these sort of transitional phases in sort of preserving an archive. So one thing to seriously keep in mind is, like, whenever you start a documentary editing project and you're looking to put it on the internet or do whatever you're going to do with it to make it accessible to researchers, at that initial moment, you're going to be using the most up-to-date sort of digital preservation methods. But then once you get 5-10 years into the project, eventually it's going to be a little bit further behind whatever the new thing is. So I see the field of documentary editing as sort of wrestling with this problem of how to keep archives accessible and how to keep them sort of up to date with what the newest technology is. And I think it's important that as we work in the field, just to keep in mind that whatever new medium we're transitioning the information to it is not going to be the final medium. And so we need to be prepared to continue the sort of pattern of migration.
So the specific question is, where do you see your place in the digital humanities space? I'm the print production editor, so I see my place as like a cheerleader. I'm very pro. I love it. Ondine is a master. Neil is a master. Like I said, there's so much going on at the Massachusetts Historical Society. So I'm really excited to just be a part of it. We do have the Adams Papers digital edition, which I have seen. I field our reference questions, and I have seen, even in the nearly 7 years I've been there, such an uptick in the amount of researchers of like when I started, it was like a lot of students and college professors, and now it's a lot of kids, which is just, oh, I get so excited when it's like, I'm a 6th grader and I wonder if you could tell me about Abigail Adams. Yes, yes, I've been waiting for your email. And also a lot of people, certainly during COVID, as we mentioned, but also in retirement, are just kind of like, I've always wanted to do my family history. And it's like, well, we have a century of documents for you to look through, and there's a consolidated index, and you can keyword search, and it's all very available. And especially now that we're adding the Diaries of John Quincy Adams, I mean, he really kept track of people, and he has the list of names, and we have the images that they can see. And so we really are bringing the archives to people. And I think that's what's so exciting. I would like to get even more firmly in the digital humanities space, but for right now, I'm very excited about it, and I'm very excited to talk it up to anyone who will listen.
Thank you for that. I'll move on to our next question here, because I do want to make sure that we preserve time for audience discussion later. How do you envision a future for scholarly editing? We might start with you, Gwen, and come back.
As I was just saying about fielding the reference questions, these kids, a lot of them are with National History Day, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. They're brilliant. Like, they're really deep thinkers. And so, like, when I started my job, it was just like, I'm so excited that I get to do this. And it has since extended to, I'm so excited that I get to do this as a building block for these kids. Because these kids are so much smarter than I will ever be. They're so thoughtful. They're looking for who is hiding in plain sight. They're not just interested in Thomas Jefferson because he's famous and he has a monument. Like, I have like a 6th grader who wants to know all about the servants in the Addams household and where did they come from and what age are they and where are all the places they appear in your edition. And I've also noticed that these kids are obviously very tech literate. And so they're kind of expecting the whole world to function like Google. It's like, I want this answer. I want this answer. And I'm like, okay, give me 2 weeks to find your answer. So I would say the future of scholarly editing is just going to be that we're going to make more and more accessible to these brilliant kids who will be sitting on this panel in 20 years. And I will be very excitedly sitting in the audience, clapping for them, but also just like, we need to be providing it and also contextualizing it. Just so, like, we want you to have access to the archives, but you're 12, so you might not know absolutely everything yet. So if you don't know who they're talking, if you don't know the French diplomat that they're mentioning by nickname, like, here, we'll tell you who it is in the footnote. And so we're really just trying to open up this world to them as much as possible. At the MHS, we do teacher workshops, and I've had wonderful conversations talking about how do I introduce kindergartners to primary sources and like what's on your website for them. We have a Center for the Teaching of History, National History Day. We also go into like, as you know, there are a million colleges in Boston. Like, you can't spit without hitting a college campus. So we go to a lot of college campuses and go to like the freshman history classes, and here's how you transcribe, and here's how you find like good sources, and here's how you navigate our website. And so I think we're just constantly opening the doors for more and more people to come in. And I just think the future is going to be dazzlingly bright. I'm so excited for it.
Yeah, to sort of, well, speaking to Riley's point earlier about multimodality, I really think the future is going to be, well, so like at the Pinckney paper is one of the things that we've done that I think is sort of above and beyond what documentary editing may have been before the internet, is, you know, we've written IDs of every person or object or thing that comes up in the text. And so people can, if there's something you're not familiar with, if you're not sure who the French diplomat is, for example, you can click on it and there's a little blurb about who the person is. And that's sort of a step beyond just providing the documents in an accessible way that's free. It's also giving people a lot of instant context that's very helpful. So I think that's sort of, not that I am really qualified to say what the future of scholarly editing is, but I think that seems to be where things are moving, creating these connections between archives and between the information that the people creating the archives already know, and making it that much more useful to researchers, sort of intrinsically, without them having to come to the archive with a lot of already knowing a lot about it. Yeah.
To speak a little to Gwen's point, certainly all of these paper projects are about the people of which bear their name, the Pinckneys, but it's become so much more than just the Pinckneys, or maybe the top down. So many people are using these scholarly editions for bottom-up history, because we are taking the time to identify the ship, to identify that one inn they stayed at on their trip, and we're going to find the innkeeper's name, and it's going to take a while. And this place doesn't exist anymore. Why can't I find it on a map? They built a lake over it in 1970. Now we can say where it is. And reaching out to the descendants of those folks that we ID'd, that might be the only place where they're going to appear in scholarly literature, and speaking out, you know, for descendant communities, for the people that were enslaved, and going through and creating over 700 IDs about people enslaved by the Pinckney families. And we did a lot of work with our volume 4 about the Creek Nation and different towns and identifying different people. So I think it's become more than just not diminutizing political or military history. It's so important and great topics about the people that are the primary focus of study, but anyone looking to do a bottom-up project can be right at home, and we are creating the resources for them as well.
Not to come across as that our project is the future, but I think from what I've seen, what I'm really excited about is projects that combine a digital archive with a digital publishing component, where I think it really gives users the best of both worlds with the edition aspect, so you can provide context, annotations, and then of course searchability, which is really important. And then while also, you know, one of the critiques I've had with documentary editions, you know, is that it's kind of like, you know, half the work, but also like half the fun, because, you know, as historians, we like looking at and working with primary sources, and to be able to both provide that sort of extra, you know, information and extra usability that comes with an edition, while also providing access to the physical document so people could see what it looks like. Because we talked about like something that we've learned, we were just talking about this over dinner, like you learn a lot about a document. It's not literally what is written, but how it is written, or just like things you could learn from. Riley talked about now and just remember from her address the other day. Like, so to be able to both provide the sort of information, like both qualitative and also like people could both see like and see what there is to, no, I don't know what I'm saying, but I think y'all get it. Yeah.
To elaborate on Zoe's and Chad's points, I see the future of documentary editing as so participatory, not just with the final product, but with every stage of product creation. I was speaking to another team at that Digital Humanities Institute, and I naturally sort of start with the question, what archive do you work with? And I'm expecting them to be working with documents housed at an institution. And they said, well, our archive is in hundreds of people's homes. I was like, what are you talking about? They're the Black Church Archives Project. And they explained that the people who are using their project, he said, these are people who don't want to turn their documents over to an archive. They want to hold on to those family records because these have been in their family for so long, but aren't those worthy of being digitized too? And shouldn't people be able to access these? Shouldn't we transcribe these? So they were securing grants to purchase technology needed for digitizing and then eventually transcribing those documents and leaving them with communities. So community members could go to these digitization bases, digitize them themselves, whatever they wanted. They could say, here's who I want to have access to this, right? Here's who I don't want to be able to access this. I just want members of our family to be able to see it. I want members of my community to be able to see it. So there are all kinds of different access levels. And they were letting people digitize their own sources. They didn't have to give them up. And that was really interesting to me. It changed the way I thought about project participation, because I had initially thought, okay, I want to make sure if I create a project in the future, people can engage with the final website in different ways. If I leave transcriptions on a website, people can navigate the search tool easily, but speaking with them about really going out into the community and assessing their needs, what they want out of a project, was interesting to me. So I see the future as increasingly participatory by allowing communities to say, here is what we want in a documentary edition. Here is how we want to access it. And I could also see that happening with different sorts of workshops. So in the community I live in Missouri, we have all kinds of great records in our archives. Some of them are transcribed, some of them are accessible. People don't know how to use them because they don't have historical training, right? So we started talking about, let's go out and hold workshops. Let's show people, here is how you can use my edition. Here is how you can use my website, and ask them, what are you using this for? And sometimes seeing the barriers they run into in action completely changes the way we think, okay, I need to change that when I do it again. So that was really beneficial. And the second thing I'll comment on is just that inseparability from the digital humanities, which I think is going to become increasingly solidified. So internalizing into a project, how do documents look different if we give people different key terms or different index groupings? so they can click on that. Is there a way we could internalize different theoretical schools like social network theory? Because maybe people don't know these terms. They haven't been in a class. They don't know. I was trying to do, for one of my TA classes, I had to go in and teach a bunch of freshman undergrads about epistemology. And I'm like, do I understand that? Like, let me look a bunch of things up here. So these are terms that are useful for forming original arguments, but I didn't learn those. I still don't know if I could define it for you like on the spot. But if there are digital tools we could use to internalize those so people can apply all kinds of different layers to projects without having to have that formal training, I think that'll become increasingly useful.
Thank you for that. In terms of talking about documentary editing going forward, I would say that the two things that I'm always working to try to consider are thinking about audience and thinking about accessibility. As I believe Zoe and Gwen mentioned, just because you build a website, just because you do all these things, doesn't mean that anyone's going to come to it or that they're going to know how to use it. One thing that I find is very useful with interns is just having them sit down and navigate our website. Don't tell them how to, right? Because we all have these senses of like, oh, well, like if you want to find that, this is the way to do it. Just, them as an average visitor to the website, how are they going about doing that? And how can we improve our website to make it more user-friendly and accessible for them as students and as regular members of the public? I think that in a lot of cases, whether it's through grants, state funding, things like that, ultimately, like American taxpayers are the people that fund our projects. And I find that it's a duty of ours in creating a project that any American taxpayer can access and understand how to use and find some use out of, not necessarily just for a specific group or someone that, is specifically scholarly in a way. There's absolutely benefits to that, but also, as being funded by the North Carolina State Legislature, I always think about what is an average North Carolina voter, how can they interface with my website and how can they get some use out of that. So that's also kind of what I think about in terms of improving the accessibility of our editions, not only just in terms of using screen readers, accessibility approved fonts, colorings, things like that, but also just the sorts of terms that we use, inviting people into these spaces, not only our websites, but also things like ADE by avoiding that kind of elevated jargon, which is very flashy and nice and everything, but it can alienate people. I think everyone has certainly felt alienated by a term here and then, quickly Googling it. What is that again? Okay, yeah, and getting back into it. So I think opening up these spaces also means opening up the ways that we communicate about what we're doing and making it transparent to people. Here are the sorts of editorial questions that we are considering, and here's why we made the decisions that we made, opening up that entire process to people to understand that, these are documents, but there's people behind them that are helping to make them accessible. And here's why we're doing the things that we're doing. That's just my thought. We do have about, I believe, 10 minutes left. So I do want to open it up for questions from our audience. Connie, yes, please.
This is a comment or a suggestion. Several of you have mentioned websites that you've been creating or working on. And my suggestion is that you take turns and put your website that you've been talking about up so the members of this audience can see that website, because I think that shows some of the work that you all have been involved in. I know particularly Zoe, the University of South Carolina Libraries has managed to hide your very valuable website behind what they call exhibitions. And I don't know about the Adams Papers website that you're talking about, or yours, Katie, at the North Carolina Department of Archives and History. But if you could just put those websites up, people can see what you've been talking about.
We can absolutely share those mercifully to our friends in IT. I don't know that we can do that with 9 minutes remaining, but we'll absolutely share those around with anyone.
You could talk about other things, but just put it up there and they can see.
Yeah, we'll work on that. Yes.
I really appreciate this wonderful roundtable. Thank you so much. It's been great to hear from all of you. And And I love the question at the end that you asked about futures, because I've been thinking this whole time about how you all are actually the future of this organization and people like you, and thinking, you know, what can the ADE do to support you as editors, or what would you like to see the ADE become in the future? And it's hard, of course, as Chad kind of said, or maybe it was Trey said, it's hard to imagine the future, but if you were going to be part of thinking about the future of the ADE, what would you like to see?
We'll have to open that up to our presenters here. Go ahead.
I'll start. Well, first of all, I think reducing the fees and making it free was like a very lovely thing to do this year. I'm all about like the soft skills kind of things, and I'm very touchy-feely. So I would say like the people I've met at ADE have made me want to continue in documentary editing as much as possible. If I came to these conferences and people were like really cold and aloof and like didn't speak to me, I don't know, I wouldn't feel very welcome. But I mean, like, I'm going to call out Deb Gussman. We were at a meeting together, and I was sitting in the back taking minutes, and I like went off to a corner away from the group and was just trying to be invisible. And Deb came and fetched me, and she said, "You have a seat at the table," and pulled out a chair for me. And I remember that years later. And Connie, I was on a panel with Connie. I was a nervous wreck. I told her that. And so she like pulled me aside and chatted to me right up until we were starting to like calm my nerves. So I would say like just continuing to be welcoming to people. If you see someone young at one of these conferences and you don't know them, if they were like me, I was petrified for like my first 2 ADE conferences and tried to hide from people. So don't let people hide. But just, you know, be welcoming, be your wonderful selves. We all have interesting things to talk about. So I would say more of the same is a good thing. A lot has to change to keep up with the times, but I think there's a lot that doesn't have to change.
Thank you for the check. Yeah, subsidizing travel as much as possible is definitely helpful in getting people, us humble, whether it's graduate students or undergraduate students or young professionals, to be able to actually afford to go to these conferences. It's very helpful, and we speak for anyone who else qualified. We are very appreciative.
Yeah, I would just say that, you know, obviously it's not intentional, but sometimes these conferences can be a very intimidating space, right? And especially with jargon involved, things like that, that even in our opening session, when Mary Jo Klein said, you know, I had to be honest, I didn't know what multimodality was. It was such a weight off my oh, what relief. You know, just things like that. Obviously, we want to think about, you know, opening up these sorts of conversations to as much as people as possible. And sometimes, you know, things like that can you know, give someone pause. So all those kinds of opportunities for collaboration and just the kindness of this organization in general, as Gwen has said, have been very much appreciated. Yes, Holly.
My name is Holly Schulman, and I am the editor of the Dolly Madison Digital Edition, which was the first born digital documentary edition published, thankfully, by Rotunda. And when I did that, when I started that, I was thinking about what difference does it make if you're born digital versus born print, and the way in which you do annotations and the way in which you can identify people, which is one of the things that I've heard you guys talk about. So I want to say just a little bit about what were some of my ideas and what generated this when I was doing it, besides the nature of a different communications medium that in itself changes the way in which you do things, if you're born digital as opposed to transferred to digital. And to me, one of the things about talking about people, mentioning people, identifying people, I would say there were 2 reasons. The first was I was trained as a 20th century historian, and moving back into the early period, I felt a little as if I was at a dance without a dance card. And so there was that question of who was there and who they were. But it's also, I think, importantly, a question of agency and the texture of history. And I think, I mean, it might be interesting here to hear from, for example, Barbara, who edited the Jefferson Papers for so long, and the Jefferson Papers are superb at identifying people and so on and so forth, but in a print environment. But to me, it was very much a question of agency. The second was a theme that continues through my head, and which I'm working now on my next project, which I'm doing with Amy Larrabee Coates over there. But and that has to do with what is the difference between biography and history, and how do we envision ourselves as editors. You can see how that I'm coming from the more scholarly angle of this, that I'm not, I believe that really good material that comes down to the 6th grade will have to come from really good work that's as scholarly as it can be and as well grounded as can be. But I do think there is, well, I'm not the only one, but I'm one of those who think that there is a difference in the ways you think about biography and the ways in which you think about history. And I think that is an interesting question for most of these documentary editors. I mean, it may not be what Ira Berlin was thinking about when he started working on a whole series of different kinds of manumission and freedom documents, but most of us are doing people. So I would say that when you think as the next generation about what you're doing, that I would hope that you would also think in terms of some of these rather larger theoretical questions, which is to say, does it matter who does what and who they are, as well as agency? And does it matter if you can combine and think both dually about biography and history? And I'm going to end with something I actually ended my first, well, incorporated into my first book. My first book was on the voice of America during World War II. And so people ask me what difference did it make, who ran what, and so on and so forth. And I said, of course it makes a difference. Suppose Edward R. Murrow had been the first head of the Voice of America instead of John Houseman. These names may not mean anything to you, but John Houseman was a playwright. John Houseman was a political activist, but he was a playwright. And Edward R. Murrow, whose name you probably do know, was trained as a print journalist and moved into radio journalism. And the way in which they conceived of news and the way in which they conceived of communicating means that the institution created by Houseman would have been a different institution had it been created by Murrow. And so that's what I mean, not only about agency and the bottom up, which also, I remind you, goes back at least to the 1960s, and in revolutionary history to Jesse Lemisch, tip our hat to him. But also, what does leadership mean? What do
These are really great questions, but we are going to run out of time.
I'm
I hope that our
I
panelists
truly
have a chance to
apologize.
respond. So please take a few minutes to respond to these great questions, and then we'll break for lunch.
Yeah, to address the first part of your question, I think a lot of what we do, and I guess this kind of links back to the classroom question, is this idea that Rebecca Scott coins called micro histories in motion, where small biographies of institutions and people, when working together, for her research in an Atlantic context, and this includes, colonizers, enslaved people, merchants, people from varying social classes to politicians. When you have all these micro histories or biographies sort of happening in motion, sort of, how does that work? And how does that have big consequences historically? So I think that's sort of answering the first part of your question. And I think that's a lot of what we do as scholarly editors when we're trying to find, this friend keeps getting mentioned, why? Or they took this trip and not that. Maybe that would be a good theoretical to couch that in.
Well, we'd love to continue these discussions with you. We don't want to keep you from lunch, of course. So please do come ask us. So we'd love to continue these conversations. But otherwise, thank you very much for being here.